Cobble. Elves and the Shoemaker Retold. A Tale in the Romance, a Medieval Fairytale series. Written by Demelza, Carlton. Autonarrated by AI Charlotte from Google. 1. This pair, Alba vowed, would be perfect. She used a cloth to wet the leather, just a little, not too much. Then she pressed the stamp against the smooth hide. A few gentle taps with her hammer and it was done. Now all she needed to do was paint the embossed flower so that the jewel-like colors would catch the eye of some passing lady, and yet another one of her creations would grace the king's court. They were no match for the christening shoes she'd made for the crown princess, but she'd sent them up to the palace. Once the king saw them, surely he'd declare her the royal shoemaker, as her father had been. Alba sat back and sighed. If only her father could have seen them. He would be proud. But he'd passed the previous winter, leaving her in her brother's care. As though they cared. Speak of the devil, and he shall appear. Her brother's laughing voices sounded from the street. Alba hurried to hide her embossing tools and the half-made shoe. If her brothers found the cunningly crafted flowers and other shapes, they would sell them for sure and drink the proceeds. Never mind that she needed them to make a living. She could not be the royal shoemaker if she could no longer make shoes. The bag tucked neatly into its rafter hiding spot, and the thatch smoothed into place as if it had never been disturbed. A good thing too, for her brother's good humor died the moment they entered the house. We need to go, Gad said, grabbing her arm. Where are we going? Should I pack? Alba asked. No time, Oni said, peering through the window. Jordanus has summoned the guards to evict us, and they are already on their way. Alba tore out of her brother's grasp. Why would our landlord evict us? The shoes I make earn more than enough to pay the rent. Only last week he stopped by to commission a pair as a gift to his wife for Christmas. He never mentioned you'd forgotten to pay the rent. Father left us plenty of money. Father's money is gone. We haven't paid rent since he died. And we need to go now or we'll be taken to the cells beneath the castle, where we'll die as debtors. Gad seized her arm again and dragged her from her seat. Now, Alba. We promised Father we would take care of you. Do you know what happens to women in the castle dungeons? Alba had heard all sorts of horrible stories about the dungeons, but she'd never imagined she might feature in one. No, she began. Then you don't want to find out. Come or all is lost. But my things, she faltered. Oni took her other arm and between them, her brothers dragged her to the back door. No time, Oni said. We can buy more when we are free of Jordanus and his guards. Do you want to live free or die in prison? I want to live, Alba said, risking a glance back over her shoulder at the cottage where she had spent all of her life. Without her tools, would she ever make shoes again? Then you must run. Bracketed by her brothers, Alba took to her heels, leaving behind everything else she had ever known or loved. 2. Brogan, I believe, the well-dressed man asked. I'm Jordanus. Brogan forced himself to smile, an expression that felt wrong on his face so soon after his father's death. I'm Brogan the shoemaker. I heard you had a suitable shop for rent? Jordanus' smile seemed genuine. That I do. That I do. Quite a bargain too. Shall we? He gestured for Brogan to follow him, and set off up the hill toward the castle. Plodding along behind his prospective new landlord, Brogan let out a breath he hadn't known he'd been holding. Brogan's older brother, Geryon, had inherited their father's shop. Father had left some money to help Brogan set up his own shop, provided he was far enough away from his brother not to hurt his business. Well, Brogan couldn't get much further away from Geryon than this, and still be within Casmiris. Across the river and halfway up the hill on the royal road that led from the main gate to the castle on the hill. Geryon could make boots for half the townsfolk, but if Brogan could catch the eye of some passing nobleman or woman on their way up to the castle, he could prove to himself and his family that he was just as good a shoemaker as his father and his brother, if not better. It's been vacant for some time, so it may need some repairs. I will charge you lower rent for that, of course, Jordanus said without turning around. You won't find a better location anywhere in Casmiris, of that I can assure you. Before the previous tenant died, he was the most famed shoemaker in the city. Why, he even made the king's and queen's shoes. The royal shoemaker had lived there? Brogan would be a fool to refuse. Show me, he said eagerly. Jordanus pushed open the door to a house that looked much like the others in the street. The red bricks showed a little more through the lime whitewash, true, but it was nothing a day's labor wouldn't fix. Brogan could wield a brush as well as the next man. What are you doing here? Jordanus demanded. Brogan entered the cottage just in time to see two small boys scamper out the back door. Looking for ghosts. Everyone knows this place is haunted, one boy called back over his shoulder. Jordanus laughed, pulling out a handkerchief to wipe his forehead. It was a long moment before he met Brogan's eyes. Silly boys. Children have such wild imaginations, Jordanus said. Haunted. So that was why the rent was so low. Brogan looked up, expecting to see some signs of disrepair, but the worst he saw was dust and cobwebs. Things that could be cleaned. There's a large cellar beneath the house and even a sleeping loft, Jordanus continued, pointing. The ladder to the loft didn't look too sturdy, but nor had the one he and Geryon had scrambled up to their own beds every night Brogan could remember. Are the previous tenants' tools still here? Brogan asked. He had some of his own, but Geryon had kept most of his father's things. Jordanus shrugged. Perhaps in the cellar. Brogan nodded. Perhaps was worth a hope. Once he'd made the sleeping loft and the main workroom livable, then he could tackle the cellar. Why, he could be making shoes for the king by next week. I'll take it, Brogan decided. Jordanus grinned. A wise decision. I'm sure you won't regret it. Looking around, Brogan was certain the man was right. No, not just any man. His new landlord. Brogan smiled broadly. I'll move in tomorrow. 3. Brogan had thought he'd need a handcart, but he was disappointed to discover that all of his possessions fitted into a sack. A heavy sack that took some effort to heft onto his shoulder, but a single sack nonetheless. Geryon's wife, Tihana, a quietly capable mouse of a woman, handed him a second small sack of food to take with him. She wouldn't miss him, Brogan knew. One less man to cook and clean for meant half the work. Perhaps now she and Geryon would have the children Geryon longed for. And Brogan would be able to sleep without trying to ignore their muffled fumbling in the dark, as the pair engaged in marital relations a few feet away from him. Maybe he'd have a wife of his own one day, when he had an established shoemaking business, and something to offer a girl. Right now all he owned sat in a sack that bounced uncomfortably against his back as he crossed the bridge and headed up the hill to his new home. The workroom was dim in the morning light, for the sun had not risen high enough to reach the windows yet. Brogan dropped his burden on the work table, sending up a puff of dust. The place had been deserted for some time, it seemed, judging by the thickness of the dust layer smothering everything. He would soon bring life back to the building, he swore. Something on the tabletop caught his eye. Wiping away the dust to see it better, he found 4 letters carved into the wooden surface. These weren't the work of a bored boy like he'd once been, cutting out leather for his father when he wanted to play outside. No, this was the work of an artist who wished their name remembered. Alba, he read, running his fingertips over the intricate curls of the letters as they sprouted into a flowering vine that flourished in a ring around the word. Wasn't that the name of a country far to the west, on the edge of the world? A country someone had loved enough to carve this into the table, so they might forever remember it. He hoped whoever they were, they'd made it home. He rested his hand on the table so he could reach for the bag of food from Tihana. An ominous crack sounded from under the table and Brogan jumped back. Just in time too, the legs gave way and the edge of the solid tabletop crashed to the floor where his feet had been. If he hadn't moved, his toes would have been crushed. Brogan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, but he was too hasty. The boards beneath him creaked, then squealed, as a hole appeared in the floor that swallowed the table whole and belched up a cloud of choking dust. Coughing, Brogan peered down into the cellar, where his table and his belongings now dwelled. Edging around the wall, avoiding the gaping hole he didn't want to fall into, he made his way to the cellar stairs, hoping they wouldn't break beneath him. Perhaps the place would need more work than he thought to turn it into a shop suitable for kings. No matter. He would see it through. Dreams were all good and well, but he knew it took hard work to succeed in the world, and Brogan would do all within his power to see his dreams came to fruition. But first, he had to go downstairs to retrieve his dinner. 4. Alba hid in the shadows beneath the stairs, watching the stranger. It had been a long time since she'd last heard whistling in the house, and yet that's the sound he made. The man's table had fallen through the floor, but he still managed to whistle a cheerful tune as he retrieved his things. What manner of man whistled while his house fell down around him? A mad one, that was certain. He strode up the stairs with a confident step, and only then did she see his shoes. Finely made boots over his wool hose, though both were plain. That made him a merchant or artisan of some kind, able to afford finery but without the need to wear it anywhere but his feet. A man who appreciated a pair of fine boots might not be as mad as she'd first thought. With every bit of her being, she wanted to stretch her hand out and touch the leather, to see if it was as soft as it appeared. A man who cared for his boots was a rarity indeed. Reluctantly, she restrained herself. What good would it do to reveal herself? She could not touch some stranger's boots. She hadn't touched a shoe in so long. Longer than she knew, hidden here in the dark all alone. Well, alone but for her brothers. And if her brothers had their way, she would never touch a shoe again. She sighed, slumping to sit on the dirt cellar floor. Hours later, her brothers found her under the stairs. What was all the noise then? Get asked. Alba gestured at the fallen pile of timber. The table fell apart, and the floor collapsed beneath it. Oni's teeth gleamed in the dark as he grinned. Did it really? The ghost must have unfastened the leg somehow. Ghosts didn't take apart tables. But Oni did. Alba glared at him. He continued on without a care, I wish I'd been here to see it. When the house falls down around our ears, then we'll be released from the curse. And we'll be free. Alba wasn't sure curses worked that way. What if we're trapped here, house or no house? Gad waved away her worries. We won't be. There's always a way out. Always. Don't you remember the stories Mother used to tell us? It's all about being clever and outwitting the witch. Alba racked her brain, but she could think of no story where thieves had won against a witch. Perhaps they had heard different tales to those her mother had told her, of knights and princesses and love. This man will not be so easy to frighten, she warned them. Oni laughed. What are you talking about? Of course he will be. The house is haunted as haunted can be. I heard some of the local children tell him about the ghosts here. He'll have packed up and left before the church bells ring for Sunday Mass. Alba bit her lip and didn't reply. Her brothers might be right, they usually were, but this time she hoped the man might stay. She smelled change in the air, and with it came hope. But hope for what, she couldn't say. 5. Perhaps he should have apprenticed as a carpenter instead of a shoemaker, Brogan mused as he fastened his much-lightened purse. Yet the new floor looked good and was as solid as the rock the castle above was built upon. A solid foundation on which to build his business. Widow the carpenter had even fixed his table for free, or so he said. The legs had somehow come unfastened, for the wood was as solid as ever, even after the table's trip to the cellar. Widow suggested some of the local lads might have done it as a prank, not knowing how fragile the floor beneath it was, and Brogan was inclined to agree. He and Geryon might have done the same thing 10 years ago, though their father would have thrashed them for it. Not wanting to cause trouble for the boys or their families, he kept quiet about it. If the boys returned, he wanted to ask more about the previous tenants, and why they thought the place was haunted. Brogan hadn't seen hide nor hair of a ghost since he arrived, though on reflection, ghosts had neither hide nor hair, so he wouldn't, would he? Brogan laughed quietly to himself as he swept the floor. The workroom was ready for him to start work tomorrow, and he'd laid up a supply of leather in preparation which he'd stashed in the cellar, out of Widow's way while he worked. He'd even found time to whitewash the walls outside. Now his shop gleamed whiter than its fellows, like fresh fallen snow. Not that there was any snow on the street to compare it to, of course. Much too early in the year. Snow rarely set in before Christmas, and that was weeks away yet. Brogan considered cutting out the leather tonight in the remaining light, but he decided he'd earned an afternoon off. It was Sunday after all, and supposed to be a day of rest. He'd go visit his brother and his wife, and see how well they were getting on without him. And get a hot meal of Tihana's cooking, for he'd sorely missed it. His own cooking skills were non-existent, and he could not yet afford a servant to do such things for him. Soon enough, he promised himself. He would sell shoes to courtiers, and no longer would he have to sweep his own floors or choke down his own burned cooking. 6. What smells of cat's piss in here? Oni asked. Now that he mentioned it, Alba smelled it too. One of the local alley cats had sneaked into the house and marked its new territory again, she assumed. I'm no cat. Gad protested. Flea-ridden rat catchers, the lot of them. He jumped on the spot a bit, and Alba realized why. You foul wretch, she cried, batting at her brother. What kind of fiend are you, relieving yourself on the floor no less? Couldn't you walk a few extra steps to a chamber pot, or even a bucket? It already smelled like that before I got to it. Gad insisted. Leather fresh from the tanner's, look. Breathing through her mouth so that she wouldn't smell the stench so much, Alba edged toward the wet sack. She nudged it open with her foot, and saw the rolled-up leather inside. Work supplies for the man who lived in the house, for she hadn't noticed them before. Curiosity ate at her. Was he a saddler or an armorer? She didn't dare hope he was a shoemaker, as her father had been. But whatever he intended to work the leather into, he must be quite the craftsman, to take a house along the royal road and all. The king and his courtiers only wanted to see merchandise fit for them when they rode along the road. Do that again and I'll empty a bucket of wash water over your head, Alba told her brother. You do that and I'll give you a hiding you won't forget, Gad growled. Don't interfere with what you don't understand. I'm only doing it to get rid of the man upstairs. If his leather is ruined, then he'll have to leave. Alba opened her mouth to remind him that no amount of piss, his or anyone's, would destroy well-tanned leather. Why the tanners used it to tan the hides in the first place. After a moment, she closed her mouth again. Perhaps her brothers didn't know. They hadn't been as eager to accompany their father to the tanners to get fresh leather to work with as she had been. They hadn't cared for his trade at all. Too busy stealing from market stalls and pulling pranks on anyone who would fall for them. If he knew you'd pissed on his leather, maybe he'd turn you out instead, Alba said. Reluctantly, she turned away from the sack of supplies and forced herself to walk away. It took every bit of her willpower not to pull out a piece of leather and imagine what she might create with it. You've turned into a shrew, little sister, Oni complained. You're lucky you never married, or your husband would have beat it out of you. Now we're cursed to endure it." It was their own fault they were cursed, and no mistake, Alba thought but didn't say. What would be the point? They never listened to her, anyway. But when they weren't looking, she pushed the sack out of the puddle and hoped she would get to see what the man upstairs created with it. She would give anything to work with leather again. 7. The bag of leather smelt unusually fresh, but Brogan supposed it was because the stuff was fresh. He'd only bought it from the tanner yesterday. Normally, leather stayed in the cellar of his father's shop for weeks or even months before it was put to use. But here on the far side of the city, he had to find a new tanner and do business differently. Maybe a year from now, he'd have the money to stockpile stuff in the cellar. For now, he could put his reconstructed table to use as he cut boots. Brogan fell easily into a rhythm, chalking outlines for uppers and soles as he portioned the leather out into as many boots as possible. He'd bought better quality leather than his father used to work with, which meant paying more and being more careful to use every scrap. If he didn't, it could mean the difference between eating meat or cabbage next week. And Brogan had never been fond of cabbage. After he finished with the chalk, Brogan started with the shears. But the light was failing, so he only managed to cut out the pieces for 3 pairs of boots before he was forced to retire for the night. In the morning, every piece of leather was wiped clean, as though Brogan's chalk outlines had never been. But his chalk supplies told a different story. Someone was playing a prank on him, and Brogan would not stand for it. The sound of young boys' laughter outside decided him. Brogan stalked to the front door. 3 boys chased each other in the street, laughing as they eluded one another. Brogan had been good at this game, and his longer legs now gave him the advantage. He seized the first boy who came close enough, and hauled him up by the collar. "Are you responsible for this?" He waved at the work table through the open door. "Me, sir?" "No, sir. I'm not brave enough to go into a haunted house, even if they say they stayed there a whole day and didn't see no ghosts." His friends approached, though not close enough to be grabbed like their compatriot. "No, he's a fraidy cat, sir," one boy volunteered helpfully. "Have you seen the ghosts?" "What did they look like?" the other piped up. "Haunted." He'd forgotten. Brogan let his captive down gently. "If I find you boys are playing pranks on my shop, you'll regret it," he said, trying to sound frightening. 3 pairs of eyes grew wide. "No, sir, we'd never do that. The ghosts would get us. That's their shop, it is." As if on some pre-arranged signal, all 3 bolted in the same moment, vanishing before Brogan could ask them anything else. Multiple ghosts, not just one. But he hadn't heard or seen anything to be able to say his house was haunted. Except for the erased chalk marks, which were just plain puzzling. Only a fellow shoemaker would know how much work they'd undone, and those boys were too young to be learning a trade yet. The ghost of the old shoemaker who'd lived here before then, Brogan decided. A man who didn't want another to take over his shop. "I won't be driven out by the ghost of a dead man," Brogan said softly, so no one outside would hear him talking to himself. "You hear me, ghost? This was your shop, but it's mine now. Someone must make shoes for the king now you're gone. Why not me?" He grinned at his own daring, hoping he was right and one day he would make shoes for royalty, just like his predecessor. In the meantime, he'd outfox his opponent. Instead of chalking all the outlines at once, he only did a sheet or 2 at a time, cutting them out before taking the chalk to a new sheet of leather. It was slower, but he managed to cut half his leather before the day ended. On the morrow, his shears and chalk disappeared. Brogan searched the house from top to bottom, but they were nowhere to be found. Swearing roundly about ghosts who wouldn't give up, he ventured out to buy new to replace what had been stolen. By the end of the 3rd day, he had enough leather cut to craft a dozen pairs of the best boots, with a little leather left over that he thought might make shoes for a child. Smiling, Brogan stretched out on his pallet in the loft for some well-earned rest. 8. The man's strong, confident strokes marked him as a master of his craft. He didn't rush as he chalked outlines on the leather, tracing perfect curves and faultless lines as though he'd been doing it all his life. Perhaps he had been, Alba thought uneasily, for he looked no older than her brothers, yet his skill easily surpassed theirs. He must have apprenticed young, or just showed an early aptitude. Like Alba herself had, though she'd had to stand on a bench to see what her father tried to teach her brothers. But this man was not her father or her good-for-nothing brothers. He took up a pair of shears and began to snip the shapes into proper pieces. Her hands itched to take up some scissors so that she might help him, working on one end of the leather while he worked on the other. So strong was the urge to join him that she nearly jumped down from her rafter hiding place to take a seat beside him. But if she did that, he might take fright and leave, so she could no longer watch him at work. And if she could not create shoes with her own hands, it was the next best thing to watch someone else do what she longed for. When he was asleep, her brothers wiped away his work of the previous day, and Alba nearly cried when she saw. It took all her willpower to resist putting it right, and retrace the erased chalk marks for him. But he would know the marks weren't his, for her touch was lighter and less sure, especially after so long. So she watched and coveted and wished things could be different. But fate was cruel and had never given Alba what she wanted before. Why would she relent now? 9. Brogan set the final boot on the table and sat back to regard his handiwork. He'd made the finest boots of his career, and it was a gratifying sight. A week's work looked wonderful all spread out like this. He took an oiled cloth and buffed the leather a little, just to see how nicely it caught the afternoon light. Tomorrow he would put the boots in the window, setting them in such an enticing way that no one passing by could resist stopping to stare. Someone would purchase them and word would spread. Brogan rose. Such an occasion should be celebrated. He had some coins left, which would be enough to buy dinner from one of the nearby inns, instead of attempting to make his own meal here. Decided, Brogan grabbed his cloak from its hook and headed out, pulling the door shut behind him. His fortunes were about to change. He knew it with the same certainty that the sun would rise on the morrow. 10. By all that's holy, burn damn you. Gad hissed. Alba's heart sank. Whatever Gad was doing, it sounded bad. She raced for the workroom, only to find it was worse than she'd imagined. Leather won't burn by itself, Oni said matter-of-factly. You need tinder and fuel, like any fire. Here, I'll get some. He shimmied up to the loft and scrambled along the rafters until he stood above the work table. Ha! It does burn. Gad shouted, his concentration so intense that he didn't notice Alba until she snatched the torch out of his hand. Why? Alba cried. Tears fell unchecked as she saw the mischief her brothers had wrought. 2 pairs of boots were already blackened from their proximity to the torch, but the oilcloth draped over another pair had caught alight, and Alba didn't know how to extinguish them. It might already be too late. Try this. Oni called. A shower of straw dropped onto the work table, smothering the boots in moldy thatch. Oni grinned, his face like an evil moon in front of the sky Alba could now see clearly through the hole he dug through the roof. The straw began to smoke. Then a tongue of flame licked up and the whole pile caught. You'll burn the whole house down. Find some water quickly or we'll burn alive. Alba screamed, running for the water butt. She dipped a bucket in and pitched the contents at the fire. Help me. Do you want to die? Bucket after bucket she threw, but it had as little effect as the thin trickle Gad, then Oni directed at the fire. May the saints send you to hell. Pissing on a fire to put it out. Get a bucket, she ordered, but her brothers didn't listen. They would burn long before hell, and she would burn with them. She'd reached the bottom of the water butt, and the fire still burned, fed by the new straw cascading from the roof. In desperation, Alba fell to her knees and prayed. 11. Fire. Brogan heard the shouts as he sopped up the last of his stew with a crust of bread. He decided against a second cup of ale and headed out to help. Fire was the biggest scourge a city could have. Once it caught, it could burn half the town before it died. He could help with the bucket brigade, for he'd be protecting his own property as much as his neighbors. He couldn't see any smoke from the tavern door, so he headed up the hill toward his house. He'd have a better view from up there, he reasoned. It wasn't until he reached the Royal Road that he realized he could see smoke, and it was coming from his house. He took to his heels as though the hounds of hell were behind him. A woman screamed as he reached the door. It sounded like she was inside the house. Inside his house? But that wasn't possible. He seized the nearest offered bucket and kicked the door open. He coughed as he inhaled some of the billowing smoke, but he emptied his bucket on the blaze. And the next. And the next. The buckets kept coming faster than he could throw them. Shadowy figures came and went, all doing the same as him. Putting the fire out, if they had to empty the river to do it. After an eternity that might have only been a few minutes, the buckets stopped. The smoke hung in clouds, but he could see the sooty man beside him. "Thank the saints it's out," the stranger wheezed. It was. Thank God it was. Brogan breathed a smoke-filled sigh of relief, which only set him coughing. When the coughing fit subsided, he surveyed the damage. His work table and everything on it was a blackened mess. The floor was awash, and a gaping hole in the thatch above let out the smoke like a second chimney. His house was a ruin, and the boots he'd made were gone. Brogan wanted to sink to the floor in despair, but he knew he could not. Instead, he thanked the man beside him and headed outside to thank everyone else who had helped. Only when everyone had gone did he remember the woman's scream he'd heard. "Mistress, do you need help?" he called, but he heard no answer. Unwilling to risk lighting another fire in his already damaged house, Brogan searched as much of the house as he could in the dark, but finally he had to give up. Whoever she was, the woman had gone, or he'd only imagined her. He climbed up to the loft, which was miraculously intact, and his last thought before he drifted off to sleep was that he'd take a better look in the morning. 12. 10 gold pieces says he leaves first thing in the morning, Oni said, kicking aside a blackened blob that turned out to be more solid than he'd expected. Ow! The kicked object tinkled. Alba raced to rescue it. Brushing aside the moldy straw too damp to burn that still clung to it, she opened the bag. Inside was a gift from heaven itself, the half-made shoe she'd left the day her brothers forced her to flee. Beneath them was the box containing her tools, from her favorite hammer to her flowers, which seemed to look up at her expectantly. Alba hugged the box to her chest. She'd forgotten about it, and her brother's stupid prank had revealed its hiding place. She'd have to find a better place to stash her embossing patterns where her brothers would never find them. "You don't have 1 gold piece, let alone 10, Gad remarked. A loud argument erupted between the two men, which gave Alba the opportunity to retreat to the cellar. Water dripped through the floorboards overhead, turning the cellar floor to mud, but she found a dry patch under the stairs. There she huddled with her treasure, wishing with all her might that she'd never need to see her brothers or a fire like that again. It was a long time before she managed to sleep, and even then the flames blazed through her dreams. 13. When morning came, Brogan searched his house from top to bottom, but there was no sign of any living thing except him. Certainly no woman. He must have imagined it, he decided. "Hello," a strange voice called. Brogan headed up the cellar steps to find a man leaning through the window. "Can I help you?" Brogan asked, feeling a wry smile twist his lips. He was no help to anyone right now. The man waved at something in the road behind him. "I heard you're in need of a new roof." Brogan stepped out into the street. The stranger had a cart full of straw, and a couple of ladders already leaned against the wall. "How much will it cost to fix the damage?" Brogan asked, praying he had enough. The stranger named a sum Brogan knew he'd never have. Brogan's heart sank. He held out his purse to the man. "This is all I have left after the fire." The man took it and squinted inside for a long moment. Finally, he closed his hand around the purse and dropped it into his pocket. "It'll do." Brogan breathed a sigh of relief. "Thank you." The thatcher set to work. Brogan retreated inside what was left of his house to see what he could salvage. The table had survived, though it was scorched black in places, but the boots were burned beyond repair. If Brogan hadn't known better, he'd have thought the fire started in his new boots, but that was ridiculous. The kitchen fire was on the other side of the workroom. There was no way sparks could have reached the table, let alone the boots on it from there. The fire must have started in the roof then, he decided. Though how, he'd heard no lightning or thunder, and there'd been no sign of a storm last night. Unless someone had deliberately set fire to the roof. But why? Who could hate him so much they wanted to burn down his house? And why had they waited for him to leave before doing it? Surely they'd have wanted to burn him with it, if they truly hated him. "It were ghosts, it were," an excited boy's voice shouted outside. "I saw the whole thing. The roof just fell in, like an invisible hand scooped it out from the inside, and then smoke came pouring out." Ghosts? What sort of ghosts played with fire? Brogan had never heard of such a thing. But he had heard a woman scream. A very real woman, though she'd run off before he could find her. Whoever she was, perhaps she had been the target of the attack on his house. If he could find her, whoever she was, then Brogan might have some answers. But in the meantime, he had a mess to clean up, to see if he could pick up some of his livelihood from the still warm ashes. At noon, one of his neighbors sent their daughter over with some food for Brogan. Brogan thanked the girl for her family's charity, for he had no other food left in the house and precious little else. The girl blushed and ducked her head, her hands lingering on the sack just long enough to touch Brogan's fingers. She was comely enough and of an age to marry, he realized with a sinking heart. One day she might make a good wife to some deserving man, but today was not that day, and Brogan was not the man. He could not support himself, let alone a family. As it was, there was a very real possibility that he'd have to move back in with his brother and his wife on the morrow. Unless he had shoes to sell. One pair that had miraculously survived the fire, or enough leather to make one last pair. The perfect pair to catch someone's eye as they passed, and came into the shop to commission more. What other hope did he have? 14. Sometime around dawn, Alba climbed into the rafters and settled in a spot where the fire hadn't touched the roof, but she could survey the damage. Tears streaked down her cheeks as she saw what her brothers had done. If she saw them or spoke to them this morning, she would only have harsh words for them, so she was glad they kept out of her sight. She didn't wait long before the master shoemaker, whose name she still did not know, climbed down from the loft. His shoulders slumped as he surveyed what was left of his house. For a moment, he looked like he might cry too, but he stuck his head in the refilled water butt and emerged with a dripping expression of dogged determination. He took stock of everything in the house, moving methodically from the loft to the cellar. He didn't say a word the whole time, which intrigued Alba, for her brothers or even her late father would have been swaying fair to color the air with such strong language. He finished just as the thatcher arrived to repair the roof, but he did not rest. No, he picked up a broom and swept every speck of soot out the back door into the gutter. He cleaned the ash off his work table before sweeping again. He looked like a priest sweeping the house of bad spirits. She longed to tell him that he need not worry, for the only bad spirits about were those belonging to her brothers, and she suspected they'd sneaked into a neighboring cellar in search of an even more troublesome kind of spirit. If it was true, they wouldn't return until they'd drained the contents of their neighbor's still, or they woke up from their alcohol-induced stupor. The longer they were gone, the better. By noon, his house looked like the fire had never been, except for the scorch marks on the table and the burned remnants of his week's work sitting in a sad little pile on the scorched timber. That's when Dagny arrived, sashaying into the house as though she owned the place. Alba wanted to slap the coy smile off the girl's face as she bent over to offer the shoemaker a sample of her cooking. Alba's rage simmered as the girl's breasts nearly spilled out of the front of her dress. She'd laced the gown so tight. And probably padded it too, Alba fumed. Dagny had often bemoaned her flat chest on the Sundays she'd walk to church with Alba. The skinny girl was no plumper anywhere else, so her suddenly buxom chest must be the result of some artifice. "Thank you," the shoemaker said, taking the food from her without more than a cursory glance. Alba smiled viciously. He wasn't interested in Dagny. "I'm sorry, but I don't know your name," the shoemaker continued. Dagny blushed and cast her eyes down at her cleavage. "I'm Dagny, daughter to William the wine merchant next door." The shoemaker's eyes darted to the door and the house from whence Dagny had come. "I'm Brogan. Shoemaker. You must tell your father to come to me when he needs new boots." Alba wanted to crow at the girl's dashed hopes. Boots for her father indeed, when Dagny would rather he was thinking of her breasts. But she had his name now, Brogan. She wanted to say it aloud, to savor the taste of it on her tongue, but she didn't dare. Brogan dismissed Dagny with scarcely a second glance, to Alba's satisfaction, and went back to his work table. He picked through the pile of burned leather, using his knife to pry the pieces apart to see if any of the shoes were salvageable. But piece by piece, he dropped the remains of his week's work into the pail at his feet. As the pieces fell apart between his fingers, then plopped down to fill the pail, Alba's tears welled again, and she couldn't seem to stop them. Brogan's stony expression as he emptied the pail outside only made her cry harder, until it was all she could do to stifle the sobs so he wouldn't hear her. Her brothers would pay for ruining him, she swore. How, she didn't know, but it would happen. If there were saints above and hell below, then there would be a reckoning. 15. Brogan finished the last of his food before he set out what leather remained. A small piece, perhaps enough for one shoe but not for two. Unless they were really small. He found some chalk, a miracle that it had survived the blaze, and drew an outline on the hide. A moment later, he scrubbed it off with his sleeve and tried again. Over and over, he attempted to find a way to fit two shoes on the leather, but no matter what he tried, they would not fit. Brogan scrubbed at his eyes. If he'd owned enough coin to buy a cup of ale, he'd drown his sorrows in it in a moment. But he had no coin and only one tiny piece of leather that would not make a pair of anything worth selling. Yet he tried and tried again, for Brogan refused to give up. He would make a living here. He had to. "And no pesky firebug poltergeist will stop me," he said aloud, glaring into the shadows that now filled the house. Somehow, he hadn't noticed it growing dark. The thatcher had long since departed, leaving the repaired roof behind. Brogan had no candles left, his last one had burned alongside the boots. No food, no light, no livelihood. He had one thing remaining to him, hope. Hope was what sustained him as he ascended the ladder to the loft, praying aloud that the morning would bring brighter things. It couldn't get any worse. 16. Alba wasn't sure what manner of thing a poltergeist was, but her brothers deserved any and all insults for what they'd done to Brogan. She'd watched him all day, wishing there was something she could do, and now she was resolved. There was no point to secrecy. If he knew of her brothers, she had no need to hide their presence anymore. And if her brothers could make all the mischief they liked, maybe it was time she enjoyed herself too. She'd regarded the lovely piece of leather with such longing as Brogan had marked it so many times she lost count. And when he went upstairs, leaving it uncut, her decision was made in a moment. Alba slid down from the rafters and retrieved her box of tools, along with the last shoe she'd ever made. Half made, she reminded herself, and it was a good thing too, for she'd need to unmake it to trace around the pieces to make its fellow. A perfect pair, or as close to it as she could manage. It had been years since she'd practiced her craft, and she dreaded finding out what she had forgotten in that time. Alba took a candle out of her toolbox, and lit it from the dying embers of the fire. She set the candle on the table, figuring the scorched timbers wouldn't mind a little wax on them. The piece of leather Brogan had left her was the perfect size for the second shoe. She wiped away the scores of chalk marks he'd made and began to trace her own pattern. Hesitantly at first, then more confidently as the warm magic of making began to take hold. She breathed it in, wanting to laugh aloud out of sheer joy, but that would wake Brogan. And she wanted this too much to hand it over to him, or anyone. Her shears were harder to handle, but still she managed to cut the pieces to her satisfaction. The needle moved like a dream in her nimble fingers, shaping a shoe out of the pieces. Giving the hide life once more. Now to make it bloom. She set her flower molds on the hearth, where the still glowing coals might warm them. Alba's hands shook as she took a cloth and wet the leather, preparing the rich red-brown bed for its very own garden as though it were life-giving soil itself, and not leather made from a beast long dead. Alba measured the shoe she'd embellished so long ago, making sure she had the placement just right, before she laid a flower mold against the hide. She tapped it with her hammer, lightly at first, and then harder to make her mark. Flowers blossomed beneath her fingers on one shoe and then the other, for the design she'd done so long ago was too simple for her taste today. The borders needed a tiny vine twining around them, the leaves placed just so, which wove its way around to the heels of this pair of dancing slippers, she decided. Not boots at all. A few more cuts and the change was made. Some lady would show silk-clad ankles as she danced in these at court, at a ball the likes of which Alba would never attend. No matter though. Alba was clumsy on her feet, all her grace lay in her fingers as she made the leather obey her every wish. There. Shoes fit for a queen. Once they were done, Alba told herself, standing back to admire them. But they were not yet done. Her paint jars were dry as a desert, but a few drops of water revived them. The brushes were as soft as the day she'd first seen them, for they were untouched, a final gift from her father before his death. She could think of no more fitting project for virgin brushes than the most perfect pair of shoes she'd ever created. The flowers would be white, with just a touch of yellow gold in the centers, the better to stand out of the russet leather. The vines and leaves would need to be pale too, so that the greenery might be seen. Alba painted until the candle burned down to nothing and she lacked the light to see. Only when she could not discern the difference between the colors did she lay down her brush. Her heart raced and her breath was shallow, as though she had run a great distance instead of sitting at the table for hours unmoving. Yet she felt happier than she had in years. Exhilarated, that was the word, with a joy she'd never thought to feel again. Was this how God had felt when he created the world and surveyed his creation for the first time? Alba wanted to laugh at her own daring. It was sacrilege surely to compare herself to God. And yet, her creation was far humbler, to be worn on feet that touched the ground, belonging to a lady who was higher than Alba would ever be. She was no deity, just a shoemaker who loved her craft. Carefully, Alba set the shoes on the windowsill, so that they might catch the first of the morning light. When the sun rose, then she would finish the work she had begun. In the meantime, she would emulate the master shoemaker and get some sleep. Alba packed her tools back in their box, consigning them to their new hiding place before she lay down beside them. She would rest for only a moment, she promised herself, as she lay back and closed her eyes. 17. A furious pounding woke Brogan, like the worst hangover he'd ever suffered. Never drinking again, he mumbled. "Hello, the shoemaker," a voice shouted, and the pounding began again. It dawned on Brogan that the noise did not come from the inside of his head, but from the door of his house. No, the door of his shop, for what other shoemaker lived here? "Coming!" Brogan shouted, scrambling down the ladder. He yanked the door open and yelped as the cold morning air hit him. He wrapped his frozen body in a cloak, before he could properly focus on the man who stood on the threshold. A man whose fur-lined silk cloak put Brogan's coarse wool to shame. Brogan hesitated for only a moment, before he bent in a deep bow. He didn't know the man's rank, but he was certain he was far higher than Brogan would ever be. "My lord," he said. Brogan must have guessed right, for the man didn't correct him. Instead he asked, "Are you the shoemaker?" The shoemaker? Was he after the king's shoemaker? His heart sinking, Brogan managed to say, "I am a shoemaker, my lord. I make shoes and this is my workshop." "Good. How much for those?" Brogan raised his head to find the man stabbing a finger at the windowsill. Where there couldn't be anything worth selling, Brogan knew, for he checked the burned remains twice before discarding them, and he still hadn't decided what to do with the remaining leather. Yet the morning light cascaded through the window like manna from heaven itself, haloing a pair of slippers so brightly they seemed to glow gold. Slippers the like of which Brogan had never seen before in his life. "Come on, man, I must have them." "Name your price," the lord said impatiently. Brogan thought quickly. He had no idea where they'd come from, but they were in his shop. Ergo, they belonged to him. "I leave it to my lord to decide their value." A purse landed at his feet, heavier than the one Brogan had arrived here with, judging by the clink of it. "If it is not enough, tell me when I return, for I will. Once my wife sees these, she will want me to commission a dozen more," the man said. He snatched up the pair of shoes, tucked them into the pocket of his cloak, and departed. Brogan couldn't seem to close his mouth. He could, however, reach down and pick up the purse. He swore when he saw the contents were all silver, a fortune like he'd never known before. This was too much for a pair of shoes. He hurried into the street, hoping to catch the man, but he'd mounted his horse and headed up the hill toward the castle. Even as Brogan watched, the man passed through the gate and out of reach. He tightened his grip on the coins. While it might seem like a dream, shoes and lords and commissions and other such things, the coins were real, and they represented the future. The future of his shop, his livelihood, his breakfast. Brogan wouldn't have to go back to Gerion's house and incur Tihana's wrath at his return. Instead, he could go buy more leather to make boots. He'd made his first sale. Why, he could even afford a barrel of ale, something he might drink in the evening when the work was done. Filled with new hope, Brogan walked on air as he headed out of the house to break his fast. 18. When Alba woke, her stiffness told her she'd slept too long. Way past dawn she discovered, and well into the afternoon, judging by the light. And too late to finish her work on those shoes, for she could hear Brogan's voice speaking to someone in the workroom above. Not Dagny, she prayed. Anyone but Dagny. Alba made her way up to the rafters, where she might spy unseen on Brogan and his visitor. She wants a dozen pairs, all different colors, to match her gowns. She sent her dressmaker with samples of the silk, so that you will get the colors right, she says, a man Alba did not know said. Yet his voice sounded familiar. She squinted, trying to imagine him less stout, and without the grey in his hair. Her father had served many courtiers, and this one had been unusually besotted with his young wife. So much so that he'd run errands for her himself. What had her name been? Bessa. No, Wessa, a girl with hair so pale it had seemed white. She'd had a penchant for embroidery, and on the few occasions when Alba had seen her so that her father might measure her feet, she hadn't been able to stop staring at the intricate embroidery on every one of the girl's gowns. Now she knew where she'd seen the design she'd fashioned on the shoes she'd started to make all those years ago and worked on last night, one of Wes's gowns. If this was her husband, then he was Lord Soma. And Alba had to hide the shoes before he saw them and recognized his wife's design. Alba's gaze darted to the windowsill. Her heart sank when she saw it was empty, the shoes were gone. Perhaps Brogan had hidden them already, she reasoned. But how would he know to do that? His nervous demeanor, the way he stammered through his responses to Lord Soma, he didn't know the man, had not done business with him before. Unless he'd met Lady Wessa without her husband, scandalous but not impossible, he couldn't know that Lord Soma would insist upon showing the shoes to his wife. I haven't seen her smile like that since our wedding day, Soma continued. And I haven't seen her smile at all since our son was born. If it will make her happy, she shall have whatever she wants. 100 such shoes like the ones I bought this morning if she must. Shoes he bought this morning, Alba repeated silently. But there hadn't been any shoes for sale in the shop this morning. The only pair had been. Her initial horrified shock bled into anger. Brogan hadn't hidden the missing shoes. No, he'd sold her half-finished work to Lord Soma and pocketed the proceeds. He was as bad as her brothers. Worse maybe, for her brothers at least took care of her. This man, this stranger had stolen her work and sold it. For a moment, she considered jumping down from the rafters and demanding her shoes back. Then sanity returned, and she knew she could not. Perhaps she should let her brothers burn the house down, only this time, with him inside it. When they returned, she would put her proposal to them. In the meantime, she seethed as she continued to eavesdrop on the two men. Lord Soma wanted more shoes like the ones she'd made, did he? Well, he wouldn't get them. She'd die before she lifted a finger to help a thief who stole her work and passed it off as his own. Instead, she'd see what he could do without her molds or her paints or her skills. Yet as she watched, Lord Soma piled coins on the table, more than enough to pay for such things. Brogan could buy his own tools twice over. A master shoemaker like himself would probably do a better job too. She didn't want to hear any more. Instead, she slunk back down to the cellar. For one blissful night, she'd created something wonderful that lit up her life. But it was time to retreat into the darkness once more, for not even Brogan needed her. 19. You will have these done by the end of next week, yes? Lord Soma asked. If you don't, my wife may insist I send some of my retainers to kill you. Brogan swallowed nervously, not sure if the man was serious or jesting. Why yes, my lord, he managed to say. Next week. Good man. Lord Soma left. Brogan stared at the silver coins on the table. More than 30 of them, so why did he feel he'd sold his soul? He could make good boots and good shoes too. The money before him would easily cover the cost of the best leather for this job. Why, if the woman wanted shoes covered in silk to match the colors of the scraps sitting like a stack of tiny handkerchiefs beside the coins, then she should have them. But for the life of him, Brogan couldn't remember what was so remarkable about the shoes in the window this morning. Not for the first time, he wished he'd taken a longer look at them. Long enough to be able to copy whatever had caught Lord Soma's eye, and captivated his wife so. He could worry about that later, he told himself. First, he needed to buy the leather, or he would never have the work done by next week. He calculated how much he would need, then worked it out again, just to be sure, before he ventured to the tanner down by the river for the materials. Loaded down with leather, pigments, thread and tools to replace the ones that burned, he returned home with just enough time to make a start on perhaps one pair of shoes. Casting his mind back to the shoes he'd glimpsed in the sun that morning, he tried to sketch a pattern that matched his memory. Tried and tried again. If only I still had those shoes. How can I make something again, when I never saw it the first time? Gah! Brogan threw his chalk down on the table, where it cracked in two. His father would be ashamed of him, whining like a child. No commission was too hard. None. But perhaps he was too tired from all the work of cleaning his house yesterday. Tomorrow would be better when he was fresh. Nodding to himself, Brogan climbed up to the loft to retire. 20. When Alba heard Brogan return, she crept upstairs to see what he'd bought. Lovely leather, she noticed with approval, and enough pigments to paint the cathedral. Her fingers itched to touch them, to examine the veritable rainbow of colors he'd laid carelessly on the table. Her breath caught in her throat at the sight of the beautiful blue. He had bought the true ultramarine she'd only seen in the cathedral, adorning the Blessed Virgin's robes. For the first time in her life, Alba felt lust. Or was it covetousness? But she didn't care what the sin was called. She wanted to grind that blue, mix it until it coated her brush just right, and paint, what? The skies on a shoe, so that the owner danced in clouds. Or should it be stars? She dreamed of what she'd create with those glorious colors as Brogan laid out the leather and worked. By the time he retired for the night, her anger at him had ebbed away completely, replaced by the irresistible desire to improve on the shoes she'd made last night. And seeing as Brogan had sold them to Lord Soma, she would create another pair from his leather, and apply color with his paints. In the end she made 2 pairs of shoes, as alike and as different as day and night, for that's what they would be, she decided. One to match the deep blue silk sample, and another with creamy white clouds to be worn with the white. She lit one candle, then another, for Brogan had bought a whole box of them, and she needed the light to work by. The clouds in her summery sky were simple enough, but she set them aside to let the paint dry a little before finishing the sky with that beautiful blue. Time to work on the night sky instead. But which stars to paint? Alba crept to the window and unshuttered it. She gasped as the winter cold engulfed her. One look at the sky and then she could go and sit by the fire, she promised herself. Yet when she looked up, there was little to see. Every house in town had stoked their fires to warm them through the night, and the smoke was so thick it formed a cloud over the city. She couldn't see a single star, she didn't even know if the moon was out tonight. Dejected, Alba fastened the shutters and went to the fire to warm herself. It took some time before feeling returned to her bare toes, but by then, she'd made her decision. The Lyra constellation, the one her father had shown her on clear summer nights, saying it was bright in the sky on the night she was born. It would turn into a beautiful design over the toes of each shoe, and she'd put a smattering of smaller stars, pinpricks really, around the rest of them. She took out her tools and laid them to warm on the hearth. This time she would finish the job before she went to sleep, she swore. The candle burned down as she turned ordinary leather into glimmering firmament. Alba was breathless when she finally set the second shoe down, but the smile wouldn't leave her lips. These night sky shoes were better than yesterday's design. When Lady Wessa wore these, she would truly be dancing on air. Alba washed her brushes carefully before she turned back to the clouds. The sky here must be lighter, less brilliant. A watery blue, almost white, but bright enough to contrast with the clouds. There was more skill to the paint and the brush strokes on this pair, for there was no embossing to guide her. Yet when she was done, Alba was proud of these too. 2 pairs of summer skies, midday and midnight, lay on the table in the candlelight. Perhaps another coat of that blue. Her brothers' unmistakable voices sounded from the cellar. They were home and drunk. Alba blew out the candle and flew down the stairs to greet them, hoping to get them to bed before they saw her handiwork. The cellar smelled like they'd finished off the still, and Gad slurred his words so badly Alba suspected they had. Sleeping this off would take them days. Days they would be too busy in bed to make mischief for her or Brogan. She breathed a sigh of relief and busied herself in getting her brothers into bed. She didn't dare return to the workroom tonight. Tomorrow perhaps. 21. When Brogan climbed down the ladder this time, there was no one banging on the door, and there were shoes on the table. He had to rub his eyes twice to make sure he wasn't seeing things. No, they were still there. 2 pairs of shoes, each pair a different shade of blue, looking more like works of art than something a woman would wear on her feet. Brogan walked around the table, taking them in from every angle. Never in his wildest dreams could he create something like this. Oh, sure, he could fashion the shoes well enough, the workmanship of these was fine, but now he could see them, he could match it. Whatever had been done with the paint though, not even the art in the new cathedral compared to it. So small and detailed, yet so perfect. He picked up one of the shoes covered in clouds. Yes, there was a tiny bird winging its way through the sky. How had anyone been able to paint something so small, yet so perfectly? As Brogan's brain began to wake up, bigger questions came to mind. Not how, but who? And why? Who had done this? If it was the ghost that had tried to burn his house down, why was it painting now? Some sort of penance? It didn't make sense. Tentatively, he reached for the nearest pair of shoes. They sat on his hand, a reassuringly real weight. However ghostly their creator might be, the slippers were as real as the leather he'd bought yesterday. And with these in his hand, he had all he needed to make as many as Lord Soma liked. Enough for every lady in court, if it came to it. Brogan set the shoes on the windowsill where he could see them and pulled a fresh hide onto the table. He'd cut the pieces for 3 pairs of shoes before his growling stomach reminded him he hadn't eaten since last night. He stuck his head outside and beckoned to one of the boys playing in the street. 2 coppers for you if you go to the nearest bakery and bring me some breakfast. He handed the boy some money and went back to work. The boy returned with a basket of bread and cakes, wearing a big grin. Brogan paid him and the boy scampered off. Brogan munched on the nearest cake as he examined the shoes in the window once more. The stitches were so small he'd have trouble copying them. These weren't the work of a man, that was certain. Unless ghosts had smaller hands in death than they'd had in life. Brogan shook his head and set the shoe down. A feminine giggle sounded in the street. Aren't those the prettiest shoes ever made? How much for them? It took Brogan a moment to realize the girl had addressed him. I'm afraid these are already sold, mistress. But perhaps I could make some more for you. He named the price Lord Soma had offered him for the shoes. The older woman standing behind the giggling girl, presumably her mother, shook her head. Then the bargaining began. Brogan had haggled in his father's shop often enough, so this part of the business came easily to him. Even if the prices were much higher. They settled for a sum that made his head spin. Why, he would make his fortune within the year at this rate. Maybe not shoemaker to the king, but shoemaker to half the court, if he could manage it. He told the ladies to return in 2 weeks for their commission, writing it down in his ledger below the order from Lord Soma. Then he went back to work. Several times throughout the day he was forced to return to his ledger, as every lady who passed his window wanted to inquire after the shoes, and half of them insisted upon buying a pair. Business had never been so brisk for Brogan, not even in his father's shop. Perhaps his fortunes really were changing. 22. But I simply must have them, Mr. Brogan, a shrill voice cried. The voice belonged to a woman who looked old enough to be Brogan's mother, but from the way she simpered at him, she didn't have maternal instincts in mind. I can put you down for a pair in 3 weeks' time, mistress, but I'm all booked up until then. I'll need to find an assistant as it is, Brogan said, his quill poised above the ledger. What will it be? The woman's eyes darted to the starry shoes on the windowsill, Alba's work from last night, she realized, though with less of a jolt than she expected. He hadn't sold her shoes, but he had promised what looked like several similar pairs to customers over the course of the day. Clever man. He'd be a rich man too, if today was any indication. Her father hadn't commanded such a high price, and he'd made shoes for the king. Brogan concluded his deal with the woman and ushered her out, closing the door behind him. Only when Alba was certain he'd gone did she dare to leave her hiding place, to look more closely at his ledger. No wonder he wanted an assistant. So many shoes, not even if he worked day and night would he be able to meet these orders and Lord Somer's. Would his assistant cut and sew the shoes, or paint the designs? Alba's heart froze. They were her designs, no one else's. Brogan's customers today had fallen in love with her work, not some stranger's imitation of it. Brogan had made 4 pairs of slippers today, in between filling his ledger with orders. 4 pairs for Lady Wesser, for her order came first. Alba stroked the topmost piece of silk pinned to the ledger page. A wine-colored gown, one that reminded her of roses. Red flowers would be hard to paint on the leather Brogan had bought, for it was almost the same shade of red. That would be his problem to solve, she told herself. Not hers. He had sold the shoes, so he must make them. Using the lovely pigments she'd played with last night. No. He had bought the materials, Alba reasoned, and it wasn't like she had anything better to do. And wouldn't it be lovely to know that court ladies, real ladies, wore her designs once more and loved them as much as she did? No. He'd sold her shoes. Hers. Not that Lord Somer had given him much choice. And he'd promptly gone out and bought more leather and paint to make more. Countless more. Alba was so busy arguing with herself in her own head, that she didn't notice the heavy footsteps approaching the door until it swung open. With a muffled squeak, she ducked under the work table, hoping it was too dark for him to see her in the shadows. She held her breath as Brogan hung up his cloak, humming, before he approached the table. His shoes were inches from her. Tomorrow I get to try my hand at painting, though heaven knows how I'll make these look like that, Brogan said. If there are any helpful ghosts listening, I would pay almost any price for your help again. You know how to make shoes fit for court better than I. She did? Alba wanted to laugh. Brogan thought she was better than him? Tell me what you need, or write it down. I will see that you get it. More colors, finer thread, anything. Just don't burn my house down while I sleep, for I've had one ale too many tonight, I fear, and I plan to sleep like the dead. Brogan kicked off his boots and climbed up to the loft. A soft thump told Alba he'd retired for the night. She stayed under the table until she heard faint snoring from upstairs. Then she knew she was safe to come out. The house fire. It hadn't been her fault, but it had been her brother's. Her family owed him a debt, for the fire had nearly cost him everything he had. I will help you, Brogan, she said softly, tasting his name on her tongue for the first time. It felt strangely right. 23. Brogan held his breath as he descended from the loft this time. He didn't think he'd find more masterpieces, but oh how he hoped. On the table sat the same 8 shoes he'd left there last night, transformed from base leather into something divine. The toes of one pair had been embossed and painted so cunningly that it looked like a full-blown rose lay atop each shoe. He had to touch them to be sure the lifelike roses were not truly there. Marvelous. Yellow flowers twined around another pair, much like the first pair he remembered seeing, but these were bigger, bolder. Their vines twined around the rest of the shoe, but the flowers on the toes seemed to shout for attention. He couldn't remember the previous pair doing that. Another had berries instead of flowers, peeping through the leaves as though waiting to be plucked. Each pair of painted shoes sat beside a piece of silk that matched the paint colors perfectly. He glanced at the window where the blue silk pieces sat beside their shoes. 6 done, 6 more to go plus the boots, he worked out, checking his ledger. A sheet had been torn out of the book, and a meticulous hand had written. You will need white leather and some in yellow gold, and some more of that ultramarine pigment for the night sky shoes. Another of those cakes filled with jam too, if you please. Painting is hungry work, and I ate yours. Brogan laughed aloud. A ghost who ate cakes. What next? No, a ghost who had saved him and made shoes fit for angels. You shall have all this and more, Brogan promised. He sent one of the street boys for breakfast, then decided to send him to buy leather and pigments too. He had too much work to do to traipse around town picking up supplies. Slippers took shape beneath his fingers, only to be laid down on the table when another customer stopped to admire the rose shoes in the window. He had a dozen more orders before noon, and still they kept coming. But when evening came, he shut the shop and lined up the day's finished shoes on the table, knowing with a certainty he couldn't explain that the helpful ghost would return and work its magic once more. He even laid the last jam dumpling cake beside the shoes, as an offering to his own personal saint. But which saint? Saint Crispin, the patron saint of shoemakers, had survived a fire meant to kill him. Perhaps it was him. What Brogan had done to deserve this most holy saint's attention he did not know, but he was more grateful than words could say. 24. What are you doing? Gad asked at Alba's elbow. He stuck a finger in the paint she'd carefully mixed to just the right shade on her palette. Where'd you get this stuff? She smacked his hand away. They belong to the shoemaker who lives here. I'm helping him. Why? Oni whined. She thought for a moment, knowing her brothers wouldn't understand her desire to create something beautiful. When had they ever created anything? Finally she said, because burning the house down didn't break the curse. We're still stuck here, aren't we? I thought I might try another way. If we help him, he might be so grateful that he'd be willing to help us break the curse. Gad snorted. Or he might just get so used to having his own personal slave, that he'll never set us free. Would you want to lose an elf who comes in the night, does all your work, and never needs to be paid for it? The beaming smiles of Brogan's customers as they bore their purchases out his shop, shoes she had created, made her brave. Alba lifted her chin. No one can do the work I do. She set a mold against the leather and tapped it gently with her hammer. What, paint flowers? Oni mocked. He picked up a brush and, before Alba could stop him, swiped it across the toes of an unpainted shoe. Seems pretty simple to me. Fury bubbled up in Alba with a force she'd never known before. She slammed the hammer down on her brother's fingers. If you ever think to do that again, I will wait until you are asleep, and the next thing I hit with this hammer will be your head. Until there is not a brain left to think anything ever again. Oni stuck his fingers in his mouth and looked hurt. You're a real shrew, sis. Good thing we saved the men of this town from marrying you. Call me what you like, but if you damage anything else in this shop, either of you, the last thing you will ever feel is my hammer, Alba threatened. Let's go, Oni, Gad said, tugging on his brother's arm. Let our shrew of a sister waste her time however she likes. We'll be better served by emptying that still before Christmas. Good riddance, Alba muttered as she smoothed a damp cloth across the leather, erasing the mark Oni had made. No one painted shoes in this workshop but her. She didn't care about the curse anymore. As long as she could paint, her life was complete. Who cared about husbands and marriage anyway? She didn't need them. The only man she wanted was Brogan, and that was because he made her shoes and bought her paint. Hardly something a husband would do. 25. Every day, Brogan cobbled shoes together and took more orders than he could make from lords and ladies he wouldn't have had the temerity to speak to before. And every night Alba transformed his handsome shoes into works of art. No two pairs were the same, as no two flowers were the same, and the pictures that formed beneath her brush took on a life of their own. Alba's brothers ignored her as they usually did, preferring instead to steal from their neighbors' stills. They drained one but found another, and they'd made it their mission to make sure no one had spirits left in their cellars by Christmas. But Christmas was coming, as evidenced by the number of new commissions Brogan accepted every day. New shoes to wear to Mass, for the new year, for this party and that. Gifts for wives and daughters, mistresses and maidens the men hoped might become more in time. Wealthy merchants came to his door too, hearing of how ladies wore his shoes at court and wanting the same for their wives at home. In the new year, Brogan would take an apprentice, he promised himself. Someone who could cut out the shoes and take the orders while he worked. When he wasn't too busy to teach anyone anything. Without his mysterious nightly visitor, Brogan would never have been able to meet the demand. Every time he put more coins into his strongbox, he'd had to buy a strongbox, then another. He thanked his saintly benefactor. But every morning, his curiosity grew stronger. He wanted to see the miracle, not merely the result of it. Yet every evening when he was tempted to hide in the workroom instead of heading up to bed, he reminded himself that it would be sacrilege to ask the saints to show him their miracles. Worse, if he saw them, would the miracles stop? Not wanting to bring bad luck on himself, Brogan forced himself up the ladder every night. Until one day, Drogo, the street boy who had become his personal errand boy, came in with a basket of cakes from the baker in the middle of the afternoon. "I didn't send for these," Brogan said. He still had the basket from this morning, containing the jam cake he'd place on the table before he went to bed, as he did every night, knowing it would be gone by morning. "It's a Yuletide gift from the baker, Master Brogan," Drogo said proudly. He grinned, and only now did Brogan notice the jam smeared across his face. "He gave me a cake too, as thanks for the business." Thanks for, if Brogan owed anyone thanks, it was his nighttime visitor. A cake seemed poor payment for such exquisite work. Tonight, Brogan resolved, he would stay awake and keep watch for his mysterious saint. Then, if he dared, he would ask how to repay him. 26. One or both of her brothers had drunk so much they'd brought it all back up again. Alba could smell the biller when she woke, and it turned her stomach. "What is it about you boys and bodily fluids?" she grumbled as she got up to clean up the mess. Oni and Gad denied they'd made the mess, and each tried to blame the other. Loudly. If they weren't careful, Brogan would hear them and come down to the cellar to investigate. And despite all the work she'd done for him, she wasn't yet ready to reveal herself to him. "Can you go and see if the shoemaker is still up working?" she asked. "Only because the air's better up there," Oni grumbled, heading up the steps with Gad not far behind. Alba muttered under her breath about the uselessness of men and her brothers in general, as she cleaned up their mess. Then she drew a bucket of water from the well and washed thoroughly until she was sure she didn't smell of vomit anymore. Only then did she venture upstairs to find 4 pairs of shoes waiting for her, and no sign of her brothers at all. No matter. She shrugged them off and set to work. 27. "Time for bed," Brogan said loudly, feeling like a fool. He added an extra log to the fire, muttering to himself about how he hoped it would be enough with the nights so cold, for he didn't want to wake up and find the fire gone out. Only then did he climb up to the loft. But instead of lying on his pallet, he stretched out by the top of the ladder, where he had a clear view of most of the workroom. The empty workroom. Brogan sighed, resting his head on his arms as his vigil grew tedious. What if nothing happened and no one came? A saint would know he was watching. A saint would also condemn him for his deceit. This was a bad idea, and he should go to bed like he'd said he would. No one was coming, now or ever. He'd done the unforgivable, and now. Faint sounds reached him, like footsteps on the wooden floor below. Brogan leaned forward eagerly. A crash followed by swaying. Brogan choked back a laugh. He didn't think saints swore. "Light a bloody candle before I trip over anything else," a male voice grumbled. Light blossomed near the fire, outlining a man's shadow against the wall. It was Saint Crispin, Brogan thought excitedly. The candle finally came into view on the table, but Brogan couldn't see the hand holding it. Then he did, and his mouth fell open. It was a man all right, a tiny man maybe 2 feet high, who had to climb onto the table to examine the shoes laid out there. He lifted one in his hands. "This is fine work." "What would you know of fine work?" Another voice grumbled, and a second man climbed onto the table beside the first. "The shoes I made were always better than yours, but you denied it." "That's because that's a lie. The worst boot ever made was better than your best." The two men squared up on the tabletop, as if ready to fight each other. Only then did Brogan realize they were completely naked, not a stitch of clothing between them. How did they endure the cold? It must be magic, he decided. For the men rolling around under the table punching each other and shouting curses could not be saints. They must be elves, magical creatures he'd heard tales of but never seen. Such small hands could paint tiny details on shoes that Brogan himself would never manage. He'd never heard of them not wearing clothes though. And he had his answer of how to thank them. On the morrow he would go to a tailor and have him make clothes for the two men. A suit each, and he would make boots to match. A fitting Christmas thank you gift for the men who had helped to make his fortune. Happy, Brogan stretched out on his pallet and drifted off into a dream. 28. "I hope your nephews like them," the tailor said eagerly as he set out the finished items. 2 pairs of hose, 2 undershirts, 2 tunics, and 2 cloaks to cover them when they play in the snow. He smiled and laid 2 hats on the table. "And my wife made these for them. We have no children of our own, see, and she thought it would be a fitting gift." Awkwardly, Brogan thanked the tailor and his wife for their kindness. He'd paid them plenty for the clothes, of course, and more to make them as quickly as possible. He hoped the 2 elves liked the gift and it didn't drive them away, for they would know he'd seen them. Yet he couldn't, in conscience, profit from their kindness any more without giving them something in return. So later that night, when he'd lined up today's finished shoes on the table, he also laid out the clothes. And added a final touch, the 2 pairs of tiny boots he'd made, hoping he'd judged their measurements correctly. Then he crept up to the loft to watch and wait. He didn't have to wait long. 4 pairs again today, one of the men said. "You going to tell her, or shall I?" "She'll find out for herself soon enough," the other said. A sharp intake of breath. "Look at this, Gad. Clothes?" A snort. "You sound like you've never seen clothes before, Oni. I remember when you used to wear them, before the curse and all. Maybe the curse has addled your wits." One of the men climbed onto the bench. "Not like this. These are in our size. Could they be for us?" "What are you talking about?" The second man, Gad, climbed onto the table. "By God's left nut, you're right." The little shrew was right for once. He seized the nearest pair of hose. "Quick, put them on." They dressed with all the haste of men caught in the bedchamber of another man's wife, when the rightful husband returned home. Before they'd even properly gotten their boots on, they ran outside, whooping and cheering as though they'd won a tourney. Brogan could hear them carrying on for some time, before they fell silent or moved out of earshot. He waited, but they didn't return, so he decided to get some sleep, happy in the thought that his gifts had been well received. He was no longer in their debt. 29. Once again, by the time Alba was done cleaning up the cellar and then herself, her brothers had vanished. They'd agreed to go upstairs eagerly enough. What had she asked them to do again? Oh, that's right. She'd asked them to tell her how many shoes she had to paint, though she knew Brogan rarely made more than 4 pairs in a day, which she could easily manage to paint in a night. It had been the first thing that came to mind to get them out of her way, so that she could clean up more quickly. Though why she bothered any more, she wasn't sure. The cellar smelled almost permanently of vomit, no matter what she did. The sooner her brothers emptied that still, the better. Though they'd probably just find another one and steal the contents of that. So there would be no end to a life of endless drudgery, slave to her brothers, with no light in sight. Perhaps burning alive might have been a better fate, after all. But there was one light, even if she only did it in darkness. Her painting. She would endure an eternity of drudgery if her nights were her own to paint until the sun rose. Alba's tread was light as she almost skipped up the steps to the workroom. Her brothers were gone as usual, but the shoes were waiting. Along with all the pigments she could ever want. She was running low on that blue though. Alba opened the ledger and made a note for Brogan to order more ultramarine. Half the city seemed to want a night sky full of stars on their feet for Christmas, and who was she to blame them? If she could wear shoes, she would want to dance among the stars too. But her toes would be bare until the day she died, unless by some miracle someone broke the curse. A tear trickled down her cheek, but Alba wiped it away. She had shoes aplenty, even if she couldn't wear them. And tonight's shoes would wear the swan constellation, or perhaps the bear. She set her molds to warm by the fire while she prepared her paints, as she did every night. Embellishing took next to no time tonight, which meant more time to paint. Tonight, the skies on her shoes would have a hint of purple to them, she decided, adding a pinch of vermilion. But the stars would be white, without a hint of yellow. It was winter after all, and the air smelled of snow. But inside, the shoe skies were clear enough to see all the stars. At least they were until a man's voice demanded, "What in heaven's name are you doing to my shoes?" 30. A tinkling sound woke Brogan, like tools falling to the floor. Ah, his elven shoemakers were back. Burning with curiosity to see them at work, he shuffled over to the edge of the loft and peered down. He saw no one at first, but the tinkling sounds continued, so he told himself to be patient. Then it seemed the fire moved from the grate to hover in the air beside the table, and Brogan's voice died in his throat even as he tried to shout a warning. He'd almost lost his house through fire once, he would not lose it again now, when things were going to so well. But it wasn't fire at all, not really, he realized as his eyes told him an impossible tale. The brown sack the elf girl wore was the same color as the wood of the floor or his table, so he hadn't seen her until she moved. Her flame-red hair, though, was something else entirely. It seemed to have a life of its own, which is why he'd initially thought he was staring at fire. Then she picked up the shoe. Visions of her destroying his work like she'd tried to destroy his house spurred Brogan into action. He scrambled down the ladder, shouting, "What in heaven's name are you doing to my shoes?" The shoe dropped. Her voice was soft and expressionless. "Painting them." She reached for a brush and dipped it delicately in a pot of paint. Brogan edged around the table, wanting, nay, needing to see her face. If this tiny elf was the reason for all his misfortunes, then by all that was holy, he would look her in the eye as he berated her for them. But she didn't raise her head to look at him. She was too intent on the shoe, stroking her brush across them as lovingly as Tihana stroked Gerion's. Brogan swallowed. He didn't want to think about his brother and his wife right now. Not with his shop at stake. He watched her for a few minutes, without saying a word. Then finally he said, "How do you do that?" Her eyebrows rose. "Paint the shoes." "The same as you would, I imagine." "I mix the paints, then take a brush, dip it into the paint and put it on the shoe." She demonstrated, but the way she handled the brush was far more sensuous than her matter-of-fact tone. Brogan set his hands on the table to steady himself. The elf girl was working some sort of magic on him. He was certain of it. "No, when I do it, it looks flat. Like when I whitewash the walls outside. Yet when you do it, I see the sky. With stars. Or flowers. Or leaves. Or vines that seem to come to life." Realization dawned that he was looking at the person who had painted not just this shoe, but everything. He sat down heavily on the bench across from her. "The flower shoes. Those were yours. And every shoe since." The tip of the brush glided into the paint and vanished, like a candle wick into hot molten wax. I made the first pair, yes. But you made the shoes. I merely painted them. The brush withdrew, dripping, before it rolled across the glorious curves of the shoe she cradled in her hand. He shifted uncomfortably. His hose should not feel this tight. Perhaps the washerwoman had shrunk them. I thought it was an angel or some sort of saint, he blurted out before he could stop himself. As he'd feared, she laughed. The sound tinkled like church bells at a wedding. My painting made you think of angels? It's beautiful, he defended himself. Like you, he almost said before he clamped his mouth shut. A smile blossomed on her face and she raised her eyes to meet his. Ultramarine, he thought. The same as the pigment she used so much. He'd need to buy more again soon, so she wouldn't run out. Thank you, she said. She dropped her gaze to the table. No one has ever liked my work before. You must be joking. The whole city is mad for it. I can't take orders fast enough to satisfy them, and the prices they pay for it. I could not afford such shoes, and yet I sell a dozen or more every day. Brogan smacked his fist into the table. And to think I believed those two men made such beautiful things. When it's you. He gestured at the finished shoe she'd set on the table. Up went those eyebrows again. What men? Elves like you, Brogan said, instantly regretting it. The other two were nothing like her. Maybe the same height, but that's where the similarity ended. Men were men while she was enchanting. She nodded as though she understood. You have seen my brothers then? She didn't sound particularly enthused by this. Well, briefly, yes, he admitted. They took the clothes I'd had made for them and they left. Her shoe thumped to the table. You gave them clothes? No wonder they did not return. You broke the curse and set them free. They will not be back unless they come to collect something they left behind. Brogan glimpsed despair in her eyes that matched the bitterness in her tone before she returned to her work. Her brush strokes were soothing now, easing away pain. Not even you, their sister? He asked quietly. Tears welled in her eyes and fell. No. Least of all me. I am worthless to them. 31. Alba sniffled, wiping away her tears before she dared meet Brogan's eyes again. After watching him for so long, talking to him seemed the most natural thing in the world. But now, he was the one watching her. Her hands at least, as she painted his shoes. Perhaps he didn't quite trust her to do it right, which was fair. He didn't know her, after all. But that hungry look in his eyes as he stared at her hands, as though he was hungry for something more than food. That look warmed her insides in the strangest way. My brothers call me a shrew, and perhaps they are right. All I wish to do is paint, and they make messes that I must clean up, which takes me away from what I love, she admitted. With skills like yours, you could make a fortune. More than enough to employ a maid to do that sort of work, Brogan said. Alba laughed softly. I cannot. It is part of the curse, after all. To work and work and work and never be paid for it. Until someone frees us, like you did for my brothers. Her laughter turned bitter. I believe this is called irony. Those lazy fools never did a day's work in their lives, yet you freed them without a thought. Brogan bridled at the accusation. I thought plenty, I assure you. I thought they had decorated all the shoes my customers bought, and I wanted to thank them. They were naked and it was so cold. How could I let anyone go naked in this weather? Especially someone I owe so much. He stared at her a second, then amended, someone I thought I owed much. Evidently I was mistaken. She couldn't bring herself to be angry at Brogan. She truly couldn't. You thought you were doing them a kindness. You are a kind man. You weren't to know. She paused, wondering if there was some shred of family loyalty left that made her hold her tongue. Brogan pounced. No what? She had no loyalty to brothers who had deserted her. They lit the fire that burned your house, she admitted. While you slept, they would undo your work or hide your tools. They wanted you to leave. Not for the first time she wished she had been able to stop them, but her brothers had never listened to her. And what about you? Brogan asked sharply. Alba hung her head. When you sold my shoes, that first pair with the flowers, I thought to steal your paints and some leather to replace them. But my brothers distracted me before the paint was dry, and I left you the stars. She gestured at the finished pair of shoes before her. Like this, but with the lyre, not the bear. Brogan nodded. I remember. With a single pair of shoes, you drove a whole city mad for stars. I will forever be in your debt. If there is anything I can do for you, anything at all. He swallowed. Name it and I shall make it yours. Clothes. Alba's throat was so dry, her voice was scarcely audible. She cleared her throat and said it again. Clothes. A gown and an underdress, some stockings and shoes. Nothing like as rich as what they wear at court. Something simple befitting a shoemaker's daughter. But it must be made for me and given freely as a gift, in order to break the curse. And then you will be free? Brogan asked. Alba bowed her head. Yes. Then I will be free. 32. On the morrow I will return to the tailor and ask for all of those things, Brogan promised her, and was rewarded with another of her smiles. He didn't even know her name. Please, what can I call you? Mistress Elf does not seem right. More tinkling laughter. I am not an elf, merely a human cursed to work like one. I am not sure real elves exist. My mother and father called me Alba. Alba, he repeated. He'd heard that before somewhere. No, seen it. Like the? She blushed. The letters I carved into the table with my father's shears. Yes. Not even the fire managed to burn that away. I carved it on the day my father told me I could never inherit his shop. My brothers, who hated work and would do anything to get out of doing it, would inherit the place I loved most, while I would be too busy looking after my husband to make shoes, he said. But he died before he could find me someone suitable and left me with my useless brothers instead. Brothers who sold everything they could, including the shoes I made, though I don't know what they did with the money. They certainly didn't pay the rent. When the landlord evicted us, they turned to banditry. Robbing travelers on the road to town. They made me tend their fire and cook for them, until they realized I would make a fine distraction. They'd leave me in the road, a maiden in distress, to be rescued by whatever traveler came past. While everyone was busy tending to me, they'd rob them blind. Alba's expression grew bitter. They gave me little choice in the matter. It was do as I was told, or they would sell me like everything else. One night when he'd drunk too much, only let slip how much his favorite whorehouse was willing to pay for me too. And it is less than you charge for a pair of painted shoes. Her brothers had tried to sell her to a whorehouse? Now, more than ever, Brogan's anger burned at the brothers, who he'd inadvertently set free. And at himself for being so stupid. They deserved the curse, he found himself saying. They did not find it much of a curse, Alba replied, taking up her brush again. Her rhythmic strokes seemed to punctuate her tale. Their small stature made it easier for them to sneak inside places to steal things and stay unseen. They could get drunk on much less wine or whatever it was they drank. I never did find out whose still they stole from. As for work, they never did a lick of it before the curse, and they did even less after. And they did not miss clothes, for the curse ensured we were never cold. Once again Brogan stared at her sack. Why do you wear that then? If you don't need to wear clothes. A rosy blush colored Alba's cheeks. I may have lost everything else, but I still have a little dignity, and some modesty. My brothers may have wanted to sell me to a whorehouse, but I am no whore, sir. Brogan stumbled over himself to apologize for insulting her. Just the thought of this beautiful woman forced to sell her body made him furious. Tomorrow I will buy you a gown to replace what you have lost, Brogan swore. And should your brothers return, I will defend you. He dug out some of the leather he'd cut for tomorrow, and set up his tools across the table from her. While she painted, he would work too. And if he worked a little slower than usual, could anyone blame him? He shared a workroom with the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, albeit the smallest one too, and she worked magic he could barely believe. 33. Brogan woke to someone knocking at his door. He raised his head blearily from the table, taking a moment to realize he hadn't slept in the loft, before he stumbled to greet his first customer of the morning. No, the first customer of the afternoon, he realized in horror as he took in how high the sun hung in the sky. Nevertheless, he recovered quickly, ushering the merchant's wife into his workroom to measure her feet. A steady stream of customers followed, giving him scarcely a moment to muse on what he'd learned last night from the elfin woman named Alba, who was nowhere to be seen now, but her neat row of painted shoes told him he had not imagined her. Like every other day since the first pair of painted slippers had graced his windowsill, he took orders for more shoes than he could make, and everyone wanted it before Christmas, only days away. Yet even when he told them they wouldn't have their order until the new year, still they agreed to his terms. There was something magical about Alba's shoes, as much as there was about Alba herself. He could scarcely wait for the day to end so that he might see her again. A busy day for you, Brogan? Her soft voice was at his side before he'd realized it. Brogan glanced at the window, surprised to discover that it was dark as pitch outside. Where did the day go? She scaled the windowsill and bolted the shutters. 'Tis midwinter and the shortest day of the year. It is never long enough to do all that you must, I find. All that he must. Brogan's heart sank. I forgot to order your clothes, he said. I'm sorry, Alba. Tomorrow. But tomorrow would be just as busy, he was certain of it. The smile she gave him was sad. The men in her life had disappointed her many times, what was one more, it seemed to say. All the more reason not to be one of them, Brogan swore. I will have them for you by Christmas if I have to sew the damn things myself. She laughed. A leather gown would be very warm, but I would prefer linen or wool for the underdress. They would not chafe so. The thought of anything chafing her delicate skin made him feel unusually warm. As you wish. He eyed the sack she wore, which looked uncommonly like the one Tihana had packed his food in when he had first arrived. Anything to get you out of that dreadful sack. She blushed, and Brogan realized what he'd said too late. He stammered an apology, but she cut him short. I know you didn't get much made today. Send for some dinner and we can work together while you wait for it, she said. Drogo had gone home to his parents for the day, so Brogan headed down the road to rap at his door. Drogo was just finishing his own dinner, and he was happy to run another errand or two, he said. Then I have a special commission for you, and you must remember it exactly, Brogan said. You must go to the tailor who made clothes for my nephews and tell him that I was wrong, for one of the children is a niece. He must make her 2 gowns to the same measurements, with all the suitable underthings in blue. One is to be the shade of the summer sky, and the other is to be the same as the ultramarine pigment you bring me for the shoes with stars. And I must have these before the sun sets on Christmas Eve. Drogo's eyes grew wide. In 2 days? What if he says no, sir? Brogan would not break his word to Alba. Tell him I will pay whatever it costs. Whatever I must. I will make his wife's shoes fit for the Queen herself if only he will do this for me. Drogo nodded. I understand, sir. And when you've done that, bring me some dinner from the tavern, Brogan said. Enough for two, I think. All this work and cold weather makes a man hungry. Drogo grinned. That's what my mother says, sir. He ran off into the dark, promising to do everything he was asked. Brogan believed him. He had to, for he knew there was no other way he could keep his promise to Alba. 34. Brogan appeared relieved about something when he returned. Probably the imminent arrival of his dinner, Alba guessed. She was partway through cutting the pieces for a shoe. I should be doing that, not you, Brogan exclaimed, reaching for her shears. You can do the next pair. These shears are mine. Besides, I bet you'll still finish yours first because your bigger hands can sew faster, she said. I never met a girl willing to wager before, Brogan said. Alba managed a smile. Living with my brothers has taught me many bad habits. If I am to rejoin the world again, I will have to unlearn them, I suppose. I see nothing that needs changing, Brogan said. And I realized today, you never did tell me how you came to be cursed. Will you tell me the tale while we work? If you want to hear it. At Brogan's nod, Alba continued, it was a few days before the christening of the crown princess. The king and queen's firstborn, Princess Sativa, was to have the biggest celebration. Guests came from all over the kingdom and further too. My brothers thought Christmas had come early, there were so many carriages to rob. And they made the mistake of robbing the princess's godmother. Brogan looked puzzled. Remembering her brother's confusion, Alba decided to explain. The princess is unusual in that she has a fairy godmother, a powerful enchantress who watches over her. A witch, if you will. My brothers had me run up to the carriage, in a fair panic, to beg for their help. When everyone was distracted, my brothers took what they wanted. I ran up, and a lady climbed out. She swore she would help me, and for a moment I believed her, but then I could hear shouts from behind her, and my brothers came flying out of the carriage to land on the ground beside me, their arms full of her jewels and things. She made my brothers really small, telling them how they could only break the curse with hard work and charity, but they howled over her about how I had helped them, that all they did was for me, and how I was just as deserving of punishment as they were. She turned to me looking really disappointed, I remember, and said, so must it be, before she cursed me too. The next thing I knew, we were in the cellar here, and my brothers made it their mission to make sure no one ever lived here long enough to make them do a day's work. Unlike you. Brogan's voice cut through her dark thoughts. Oh, this is hardly work, Alba said. I love painting. I always have. If I could choose anything to do in life, it would be this. There's something about creating something beautiful from nothing. And when it's done, making something else. No two the same ever, because I am not the same. Some days I am happy or sad or reflective, or angry at my brothers, or hungry and wishing I had a jam cake. She smiled to soften what sounded like an accusation. I know why there are none tonight, of course. But other nights my brothers sometimes stole it before I could come up here. This got Brogan's attention. Come up here? You mean you live here with me? We sleep in the secret cupboard in the cellar. All the houses hereabouts have them. Most of them use it to hold a still for liquor or perhaps a strongbox, but yours has been a house for elves. A sudden thought occurred to her. Where do you keep your strongbox? If my brothers know, they would have tried to take it with them when they left. Brogan turned pale. I heard clinking sounds last night and didn't think. He raced up the ladder to the loft, then came down shaking his head. It's gone. All of it. Alba cursed her brothers, then cursed them again. They will pay for what they've done to you, she swore. And to you. What they've done to both of us, and who knows how many others. There will be justice, Brogan said. Alba stared at him for a moment. He truly meant what he said. There shall, she said. 35. Darkness gathered on the night before Christmas. Brogan hoped against hope for a knock that he had not yet heard when someone tapped tentatively at his door. "We're closed," he called. No more shoes until the new year. He set down the pair he'd been making, the tiniest, most delicate boots he'd ever beheld. Even then he suspected they'd be too big for Alba, but he couldn't trust these to anyone else. "It's for your niece, sir," came Drogo's voice. Brogan threw open the door and embraced the startled boy. He traded the package for a purse of silver, wished the boy a good Christmas, and shut the door again. Brogan untied the package of clothing with feverish hands. They had to be perfect. Nothing less would do for Alba. He breathed a sigh of relief when the contents of the parcel met with his approval. He took a moment to buff the boots before adding them to the parcel and tying it up again. He hid the bundle under a pile of leather, hoping Alba wouldn't find it. Tonight he would give her the clothes she'd asked for and she'd be free. Free of the curse. Free to go and live whatever life she chose. Far from him. Brogan's heart froze in his chest. She would leave just like her brothers had, and he'd never see her again. Clothes and boots would not be enough. Alba deserved everything, and if that's what she wanted, then she would have it. Brogan seized his cloak and threw it around his shoulders. He needed one more thing before Christmas, and if he had to break down the door to get it, he would. 36. Alba's first Christmas Eve without her family felt strange. Not that her brothers had ever bought her gifts, though her father always had. She'd considered making a gift for Brogan, but it didn't seem right to take his leather and paint, only to give them back to him disguised as a gift. Oh, she could craft him a pretty pair of boots, but his own were so fine it would be silly to attempt to replace them with her own ordinary work. He was no fine lady to want painted dancing slippers. The other shops in the street had shut early, much like Brogan had done here, so that they might enjoy a dinner with their family before the cathedral bells summoned them to the midnight mass that marked the start of the Christmas period. She hadn't attended such a mass in years, and the ones in her memory held a kind of magic. Thousands of candles, reflected by the snow outside and the shiny mosaics inside. The whole city awake and celebrating at a time when they were normally asleep. Despite Brogan's promises, she couldn't quite make herself believe that tonight she might finally join them once more. After all, he'd forgotten about her, hadn't he? He'd left at dusk, heading out in a rush, perhaps late to dinner with his family. He had a brother who was married, a shoemaker on the other side of town. She'd heard him talk about gifts for his niece and nephews when he sent Drogo out on errands, so the couple evidently had children too. Christmas was a time for family, so of course he would spend as much time as possible with them. She had run out of shoes to paint. The last orders had gone earlier in the day, Christmas shoes covered in mistletoe vines. Brogan had even sent Drogo out to find her some mistletoe that she might use as a model to paint the design. The bunch had sat on the table beside her since yesterday, but she'd hung it from the rafters to dry now the shoes were all done. Perhaps she should make a start on the orders for the new year, that could be her gift to Brogan. Less that he would have to do later. And it would be nice to make shoes again. She'd spent so much time painting she'd barely sewn a stitch. She didn't want to lose her skills, for they were the only thing she had. Yet for a moment she dreamed what it might be like if Brogan had brought her clothes, like he'd done for her brothers. She would be free to join the rest of the city at the midnight mass, and afterward, she would have no home to go to. She would have to take sanctuary at the cathedral, or find a convent willing to take her in. For she had nothing. She was nothing. At least here she was warm and dry and could make pretty shoes. Everything she'd ever wanted was here, within these four walls. Why would she ever want to leave? It was for the best that Brogan had forgotten to bring her clothes, Alba told herself. Freedom was a fine thing for some, but she wouldn't know what to do with it. 37. A gust of wind caught Brogan's cloak as he opened the door, and he found himself doing a silly sort of twirl to get free of it, before he could close the door behind him, shutting out the cold. "The old men say it will snow before morning," he said. Alba smiled and set down her sewing. "That will be pretty to see." Would she still be here in the morning? Or ever? Brogan's mouth was terribly dry. The house would be empty without her, and so would his heart. "I asked Drogo to bring us dinner. I left it by the fire so it would stay warm," he said, rushing to the hearth. He set out their meal, keeping his gaze firmly on the table so he wouldn't meet her eyes. Was it wrong to want one last meal with her before she left him forever? Yes, he owed her the freedom he'd promised, and he would give her everything she'd asked for before the night was over. He just wanted one more night was all. One night with her to remember after she'd left. For no amount of gold would be enough, he knew. Not for a girl who could mint the stuff with a paintbrush. She could present herself at court to the Queen and claim her place as royal shoemaker, just like her father once had. She didn't need him at all. "I thought you would share a meal with your brother and his family," Alba said. Brogan laughed. "His wife will have none of me at the moment. She's with child and it makes her terribly ill. My brother has asked me to stay away until the babe is born. He has wanted children for so long, he would do almost anything to keep it safe. As a good father should." The words came out sounding so bleak, Brogan found himself staring at her. But her father had left her in the care of her brothers, and her brothers had deserted her. Brogan would never do that. He bowed deeply. "I am new to being a host, for this is my first Yule here, but I hope this small feast is good enough for you, Alba." "Venison stew, dumplings, and cake. This is hardly a small feast." No, that it was not. Brogan sat down, and she shifted along the bench until she sat across from him. There was silence as they ate, until Brogan realized he'd forgotten something. "The wine," he cried, shoving his bench back from the table. Her stew slopped out of her bowl and splattered across her front. Alba swabbed at it ineffectually with a cloth, but she only spread the stuff further. "Times like these, I wish I had something else to wear." She rose from the table. "Please excuse me. I must go wash." Brogan swallowed. It was time. Now or never. "Please. Take these with you," he said, pulled the wrapped bundle from under the pile of leather. "Brogan." She sounded so uncertain. Tears glistened in her eyes. He bowed his head. "I keep my promises." 38. Alba drew a bucket of water from the water butt and hid in the shadow of the cask, where Brogan wouldn't see her undress. The once stiff sack had worn so thin in places it was as soft as linen, but the coarse weave had left stew on her skin. Alba washed herself, then dunked the sack in the bucket, scrubbing at the stain until it was back to its normal shade of brown. She wrung most of the moisture from it, but it would still be some time before it dried in front of the fire. That left the bundle Brogan had given her. With shaking hands, she untied the thongs holding the leather covering together. It was softer than the stuff she made shoes with. This would make beautiful gloves, she thought. Then the wrapping parted and her mouth dropped open. A bundle of blue and white wool nestled in the leather, like a gift from heaven itself. A creamy underdress in wool so soft it must have come from a lamb. Another in linen, so finely woven she could see through it. Blushing a little, Alba reached for the blue. This gown was far from transparent. It was made of thick felted wool, warm enough to keep out the cold even on a winter's night, though it was the color of the ultramarine night sky. And beneath it, a gown that was surely silk, as bright as the sky in summer. Alba wanted to cry. She could never wear something so beautiful. She was a shoemaker's daughter, not a court lady. But if she was to wear a wet sack or warm wool, Alba would make her choice. She wouldn't want to appear ungrateful for Brogan's generous gift. She slipped on the underdress and the matching hose. The blue woolen overdress laced up the front, letting a little of the underdress show through. She longed to see herself, but there were no mirrors in Brogan's shop. Something she should suggest to him, for his feminine clients would certainly like to see themselves wearing their new purchases. "Does it fit?" Brogan asked. Like the gloves that would one day be made from the leather wrapping, Alba thought. "Yes," she said. "Even the boots? I thought I might have made them too big." "Boots?" Alba lifted up the precious silk dress and found there was more. A cloak with deep blue felt on the outside, lined with lamb's wool, and beneath that, a pair of Brogan's finely crafted boots. She didn't need more than a glance to know they were precisely her size. He had done this for her. All for her. Alba slumped onto a stool, rocking a little as she tried to blink back her tears before they could fall. No one had ever been this kind to her. No one. She didn't deserve this. She didn't. "May I help you with the boots?" "I can remake them if they are not right," Brogan said, peering over the water butt. Unable to speak, Alba nodded. His warm hand enveloped her foot, his touch unmistakable even through her stockings. With great care, he eased her foot into the boot and set it on the floor. One more boot, and she would lose her home again, perhaps for the last time. She burst into tears. "What's wrong? Does it hurt? Did I make it too small?" Brogan asked, tearing the boot off her foot so he could examine it. "No, it fits perfectly," she whispered, not willing to lie to him. He stared at the boot for a long moment, before he let it fall to the floor. "But it is not good enough. I saw that you had clothes suitable for court, but even the unadorned shoes you make are far finer than these. Boots fit for commoners, that's all I am fit to make. Whereas you deserve something finer. Shoes fit for a queen. I will begin again." Alba opened her mouth to protest that she was as highborn as he, with no aspirations to wear court shoes ever. All she wanted to do was make them. But if she did, she'd have to put on his gift, and her days as a shoemaker would be over. His gift, shoes and all, were more than she deserved. "No, give them to me. I shall put them on. They are perfect," she choked out, holding out her hands for the boots. But he refused to give them to her. "They are far from it, I'm afraid. I should not have given them to you in such a state, but it's Christmas Eve, and I wanted to thank you properly. In my impatience, I make a poor shoemaker indeed. Please forget you ever saw boots such as these, and allow me to make you something more suitable." Gratefully, she acceded. He took her hands and kissed them. "Thank you." Her skin tingled at his touch, and she felt her face grow hot. Ducking her head to hide her blush, Alba mumbled, "I'd best go see if my things are dry yet. It would be a terrible crime should I spill paint on something as beautiful as this gown." Within moments, normalcy was restored as she smoothed the softened sacking against her skin before sitting at the work table. If her heart beat a little faster in her breast, she did her best to ignore it. 39. She barely noticed when Brogan bade her farewell to go to the Christmas Mass in the cathedral. She had not attended church since her father's funeral. Her brothers were as faithless about their faith as most other aspects of their lives. She wondered at the state of her soul, that she was not willing to don the boots Brogan had given her so that she might attend Mass. Even if she had, she suspected no amount of religious fervor would be enough to atone for getting cursed in the first place. Or for choosing to remain cursed, rather than go to church. Alba shook her head. Let the priests worry about the state of her soul, should she have a chance to meet one again. She was a shoemaker, not some scholar, and it was best that she occupy her worried mind with working leather. Brogan might have chosen to take a week's holiday, but he had orders enough for the new year to keep her busy day and night until year's end. She unrolled a piece of leather on the work table, and set to work. She had begun to cut out the third pair of shoes when the door slammed open, sending a vanguard of icy air to assault the warmth of her safe haven. If cold air was to be her only unwelcome visitor, Alba would have closed the door and forgotten all about it. However, her two brothers, each easily thrice her size, crowded in, making her wish that perhaps she had gone to mass with Brogan and the other townsfolk. Alba's heart fluttered within her chest as she backed away. What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice trembling as though it had taken a chill from the air coming through the still open door. Oni kicked the door shut behind him and grunted. Gad looked her up and down. "Why are you still small? The curse is broken." Alba shook her head. "For you, maybe. Not for me. He gave you clothes but not me." She hoped her face did not betray her lie. She swallowed. "You should go. He knows you took his money. If he finds you here, he will summon the guards and—" Oni seized her arm. "We're not leaving without you," he said. "You're our family. There is no way we'll let some stranger profit from your labor." Alba's heart softened. Perhaps her brothers did care for her after all. "The whorehouse won't take a girl so small," the madam said, Gad said. He frowned. "But we can't leave you here, either. That bastard's getting your services for free." Alba's heart died a little more. She might not be certain of her soul, but her brothers were both damned. "It is my life and my services," she hissed with vehemence. "I choose whether I make shoes or lie on my back or pretend to be in need of assistance while you rob my benefactors blind. Not you." Gad backhanded her with his free hand. "Tell that to the madam who buys you, and she'll have you whipped. And she will buy you, mark my words. There are plenty of men who like their girls young and unbroken. Especially ones as pretty as you." He yanked her arm, pulling her toward the door. Alba planted her feet. "I will not." But it was no good. Oni picked her up bodily from behind, and no amount of kicking or screaming would make him let go. Gad grabbed a sack, emptied the contents unceremoniously on the floor, and with Oni's help, shoved her inside, head first. One of them must have tied the sack shut, and, judging from the smell, shoved the sack under his coat. She could scarcely breathe, but she forced herself to drag in a lungful of foul-smelling air, so that she might scream loud enough for someone to hear her and help. Muffled by the sack and her brother's clothes, she could hear their worried voices but not the words. But no amount of cloth could protect her from the bite of the icy wind as her brothers opened the door. But the wind carried more than cold this time. Alba thought she could hear the strains of a song and the shrill cry of a baby. Was the mass over, with people returning to their homes? She hoped so. If she could hear them, they would definitely hear her. She screamed, then sucked in a breath and screamed again. Her brother drew the sack out from under his coat and slammed it against the wall, knocking the breath from her lungs and all thoughts from her head, if only for a moment. The sack, with her inside, tumbled to the floor, as though her brothers felt one blow was not punishment enough. "Brutes! You're both uncaring, unfeeling brutes. Lazy, useless." "Alba! Is that you?" This voice belonged to Brogan, not either of her brothers. Someone fumbled with the mouth of the sack, unfastening it so that Alba could climb out. She found herself sitting in a puddle of coarse cloth, on the threshold of Brogan's open door. She tried to take a step out, to see where her brothers had gone, but she smacked into an invisible barrier, as though the open door were closed to her. Was that the wall the sack had hit, tumbling down it to deposit her on the floor? Had this cursed barrier saved her from her brothers? "What happened?" Brogan asked. Alba drew in a deep breath, then another. Even a third was not enough to still the shakiness in her tone as she said, "My brothers were here. They tried to take me to sell me." As a whore, her treacherous mind added, but she could not bring herself to say the words. For Brogan to think of her so, she could not bear it. Better to be cursed than what her brothers wanted her for. The curse had saved her from a terrible fate. So she had been right to refuse to put on the shoes, she reflected. For surely worse damnation waited for her in whatever hell her brothers had in mind for her. 40. Brogan was headed straight to hell, he knew it. All the way to the cathedral and every moment of the Mass, all he could think about was her. Alba. She'd looked like a princess in the clothes he'd given her, but the boots, by all that was holy, the boots. They were the best he'd ever made, and they weren't good enough for her. She deserved perfection, for all that she'd done and all she'd been through. She deserved shoes from the hands of a master of her craft, like she was. But there was no shoemaker better than she was in the city, and he could hardly ask her to make her own shoes. He would watch her as she worked, and learn how to create a pair of slippers as pretty as the ones she painted. And when he did, she would run away as swiftly as her brothers surely had, free of the curse. Free from the shoemaker's shop. And free from him. The very thought squeezed his heart within his chest, as if he'd put his own heart into a vice instead of a shoe. There was no shop without her. There was nothing without her. And yet, he could not bear to see her suffer as she surely must under such a curse. What kind of selfish bastard thought of his own desires over that of others at Christmas? Not him. Not any more, he vowed. Once the Mass was ended, he would go home and sit across the work table from Alba. He would watch her at her work and copy as closely as he could. He would free her before the sun rose on Christmas morning, he swore. As if in response to his solemn oath, the choir erupted into a joyful hymn. The Mass was over and he hadn't heard a word of it. Perhaps he could redeem himself a little by keeping his oath, he thought, as he wrapped his cloak tightly about himself to brave the cold outside. He found the street full of people ambling home, singing that final carol with breath that clouded into condensation before them. He longed to hurry home to Alba so that he might set to work on setting her free, but she wouldn't begrudge him a few minutes to share the good cheer of his neighbors. Though she might if she heard him, his singing skills left a great deal to be desired, or so his brother had told him. A scream sliced through the merry song, stopping the crowd in its tracks. With everyone at the cathedral, the voice had to belong to Alba. He pushed his way through the crowd and they parted to let him through, not willing to go any further. "It must be the shoemaker's ghost," said one voice behind him. "Nay, 'twas a woman's voice," said another. "Maybe it's a girl ghost," piped up a third. Brogan prayed that nothing had happened to Alba to turn her from a living girl into a screaming ghost. He found his door wide open, with a lumpy sack sitting on his doorstep. The sack squirmed then swore. He'd never heard a sweeter sound in his life. "Alba! Is that you?" he asked, lifting the mouth of the sack. Someone had tied it shut, so he had to pull off his gloves to work on the knot to release her. She rose from the sacking like a siren emerging from the depths, blinking in the light of Brogan's lamp. She took a step forward, then sat down suddenly, bewilderment wrinkling her forehead. "What happened?" he asked. Her eyes brimmed with tears, but she drew several great gulping breaths that seemed to calm her a little. "My brothers were here. They tried to take me." Brogan's anger blazed brighter than the fire that had nearly burned his house down. Lit by the same two cumberworlds who did not deserve a sister like Alba. He gathered her up and kicked the door shut, then bolted it. "They shall not have you. I will defend you with my life," he told her. She struggled in his arms, sliding out of his grasp to the floor. "There is no need. As long as the curse lasts, I am confined to this house. I cannot step out the door," she said. Relief coursed through him, followed by stinging guilt. What kind of man did it make him that he could rejoice in Alba's misfortune, wishing her curse to continue? It made him an oath-breaker. For if he did not make another pair of shoes to free her by morning, his oath was forsworn. He could keep her safe yet cursed, or set her free to face a terrible fate. No matter what he did, he could not keep his word. And Alba did not deserve an oath-breaker. He heaved a deep sigh. I owe you my life and my livelihood. In thanks for them both, I would give you anything you asked for. Your freedom, my life in your defense, anything. What do you want from me, Alba? She stilled, staring at him as though she'd never seen him before. Or perhaps no one had ever asked her such a question. I want more paint and more leather and the freedom to create with them. That's all I've ever wanted, she said, her voice small. Almost as though she didn't expect to be heard. You shall have all the paint and leather I can supply, Brogan said eagerly. I shall have an extra bolt fitted to the door and a bell too, so that no one may enter unannounced. And I shall send an order to the tailor who made your gown. Only now did he realize her gown was gone, and she wore sacking once more. What happened to your dress? Did your brother steal that too? Alba's cheeks flushed pink. I took off all that finery. I didn't want to get paint on any of it. It's safely stored in its original wrappings. Perhaps you should keep it with your other valuables in the loft. It is not too much for a simple shoemaker's assistant. I just want to sit in the corner and make shoes. And if people like my shoes, it is enough. It was nowhere near enough, but it would do for tonight.